Okay, hello. Are we ready to continue with this great adventure in human civilization, written very, very large, as it were, right? Just one note about the textbook and the way it's set up, which I think I might have mentioned already, but um, when I have students in class, I spend a little bit more time on this. This textbook is set up so that it has contemporaneous events over a certain period of time, 500 years, 1,000 years, something like that, right? Trying to coordinate events together so that you can put one next to each other, one contemporaneous sequence of events next to another. And so that chapter on riverine civilizations puts Egypt next to Mesopotamia, which certainly makes perfect sense. And indeed, there is a great deal of coordination and exchange. And indeed, as Jared Diamond indicates, the Fertile Crescent, that part of the world, was critical for, domesticating a whole series of animals and plants that are critical to the growth and development of it, and all that stuff will come together in Mesopotamia and Egypt, more or less contemporaneous. Mesopotamia a little bit earlier than, sort of gets a start a little bit earlier then, but that's because the region was a little bit harder to tame. Egypt then, so Mesopotamia, we could give it a starting point of 4000 BC, but there's stuff that you know predates that more or less, but put that as a starting point. And then for Egypt, about 3,500. And what's going to happen is Egypt's going to pull people in very, very fast from the surrounding regions. The Sahara is drying out, right? Other areas are drying out. People are being pulled in, right? Particularly as it begins to develop a reputation as sort of an agricultural um, treasure chest of sorts. Um, in that chapter, then, we also have the Indus River Valley, which uh, to a degree is contemporaneous, right? But it seems to have begun somewhere around 2500, right? And so 2500 BC, by that point, both Egypt and Mesopotamia have 5 to 700 years of sort of growth and development of urban based civilizations and riverine civilizations going on in their parts of the world, right? But it is contemporaneous in that it overlaps with Mesopotamia, and indeed will trade with Mesopotamian city states. And all three of these examples sort of come up against a brusque line in the sand, which is the drought, the sort of apparently worldwide drought that sort of, again, a sort of a climate shift that occurs very abruptly around 2200 BCE and will last for 50 to 100 years, depending on where you are. And Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus River Valley, Egypt and Mesopotamia sort of collapse and have to reconstitute themselves. Egypt will become something of an imperial kind of a kingdom, and eventually in the new kingdom will go out and conquer areas outside. But that's again after that period of time. Mesopotamia, the city states in the south, Sumer or all of this Eridu and whatever, right? Um, there's what 12 of them, right? They kind of disappear, right? For a variety of reasons. Agriculture ceases to exist. They've been salted out and this kind of stuff. And civilization continues to take advantage of that Mesopotamia, named by the Greeks, the land between the rivers, right? And move further north. And we saw that already beginning before the collapse around 2000, right? With Sargon of Akkad in 2350, right? Um, okay, so that works well for that period of time, and they are contemporaneous in many respects. Um, and so there is another way of sort of putting things together in that sense and thematically grouping them together, right? And so we have an additional example of a riverine civilization in China with a two river system. The Yellow River further to the north, coming down out of the mountains and then bending out in the direction of the Pacific Ocean. Um, then below that to the south, you know, some distance apart, 100, 200 miles apart, different areas, they bend and twist and this kind of a thing. You have the Yellow River. Okay. And they have many of the attributes that we've seen in all three of the areas, right? They will flood. They will create floodplains by overwhelming the banks and depositing silt on them, and over centuries creating this deep, rich earth that once you plant it has the potential for producing spectacular um, crops and surplus production, which then becomes the sort of foundation stone for the growth of civilization, right? Kind of a thing. But what's going to happen in China is slightly different. So let's get into it, right? And so the chapter begins by um, you have to go back to page 28, right? So what I've done is I've culled from the textbook page 28 to 30, I think it is, right? Which really sort of looks at the very first emergence of agricultural systems um, in Asia with a sequence of events in pages, what is it? I think it's 101 to 111, something like that, right? That's in the second chapter, right? I'm pretty sure that's the second chapter, right? And then in the next lecture, I will look at the growth of the first true dynasty that we have relatively good documentation and archaeological finds on it, called the Shang Dynasty, which will emerge sometime around 1600 and then last for several hundred years, but will be sort of like a mythical touchstone, the origins of civilization, right? And actually, even before that, there's something called the Shia dynasty. Archaeologists have not been able to really discover where it was. And there are those that speculate that it may have been some sort of a confederation of local chieftainships, where one chief sort of has something like an overlordship over the others, but there's no real core urban area with institutions and things like that, right? It's more a semi-tribal kind of a thing, but that's and that's speculation too. So let's go back again. So the textbook will take us back to 15,000 years ago, 13,000 BC, which is the end of the last ice age, and it comes together then and is part of a climate shift, let's face it, in which the glaciers of the world begin to melt, right? And we are seemingly facing something rather similar ourselves in today's world, right? And we're facing hell. I'm facing it on Long Island. I live on Long Island, and progressively, there are areas very close to my house. I do live up on a hill because I live on the North Shore, right? And there are areas down in the coastal area, a mile from my house, right? But just going down the hill and down to the beaches. And there are houses there, built, sort of on a sandy bluff overlooking the Long Island Sound, right? With a lovely bay behind it and grasslands and things like that. And progressively what we see is high tides are increasingly coming up out of the bed, covering the roads, coming up into the front yards of people, right? And people who have their houses on that stretch of sand are really facing, one of those dilemmas. And who knows, a storm can come in and sort of, and we had a hurricane come across right over the eye came over Port Jeff. And how many years ago was that? Maybe 15 years ago, something like that. Could have been something like that. 15, possibly 20 years ago. So I was in that house. Okay, been in this house 25. No, 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 I'm wrong. So it's possibly 40. No, about 33 years ago, something like that. Any case, right? So we're facing it, right? And the coastline of Connecticut is facing it. Hell, New York City, in Bridgeport, I know I take the ferry, and recently they've raised the sort of barriers against the sea. And every time I go there with, to park, to wait to get on the ferry, I see, wow, you know, when high tide comes in, it's getting higher and higher and higher. Well, this is a period of time that went through something similar like that. But it reversed what had gone before it, where indeed the buildup of ice and snow uh, on on mountaintops and on continents and things like that, right, had actually decreased the level of the oceans, right? Took water out of the oceans, kept it in a frozen form on the land, right? And now we're reversing that process to an even more extreme, where the poles are starting to melt on us, and if all of that gets converted into water in how high the water will rise, a place like New York City or my son who lives in Miami, these kind of places may not be long for the planet, right? And believe me, nature could give a damn where you build something, right? If the water's coming, the water's coming. And the Dutch have been fighting this for years, building dikes and trying to, actually expand into the sea, right? And they've really spent money recently to build seawalls and things like that because they have so much money invested in it, right? Let's go back to 13,000 BCE, looking at Asia, right? This process then is going to increase the amount of water on the land, increase rivers, lakes, things like that. One of the things it does is it creates the Japanese islands. Not that the land wasn't there, but those islands were connected directly to the continent. And as the waters rose, suddenly you had the Japanese Sea separating Japan from the mainland itself, right? And this produced an unusual situation where the hunter gatherers who lived there and had been able to roam around a much larger area suddenly found themselves constricted to these islands that gradually were isolated off one from another, to the point where they killed off the animals there. And suddenly they had to start looking for alternative sources of food. And they will be looking then at cultivating different kinds of crops. But of course, the issue always is what's there, as Jaron Dyer really indicated to us quite well. You can only cultivate what you have there in a wild form that is, that has something that's edible and valuable for humans. Otherwise, you just can't, right? That's sort of like in Latin, a sine qua non, without which nothing, right? So without that, you can't do anything, right? In any case, Japan begins to isolate it off, and what we find then on the continent is the emergence of two major cultigens. You could probably guess one without even thinking about it. It's rice, right? And so rice gets cultivated in that part of the world. And indeed, there will be a couple of different varieties that eventually get cultivated there, right? And as we know, like sort of the Japanese have their own style of rice that they cultivate, and they They don't like other kinds of rice, right? This kind of a thing, right? And there are forms of rice that are sort of indigenous to India and elsewhere, right? But in any case, what we have here is a north-south division. Rice becomes the crop of choice in the southern regions, um, because the southern regions are warmer and wetter. As you move further to the north, and sort of north, yeah, north and slightly interior, northwest, right? You come to higher, drier areas where people begin cultivating millet. Um, when I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa, I lived in an area in Africa where Africans cultivate millet. In fact, there was a group, an ethnic group, tribal group, just north of the group that I live with. And they were sort of cousins by language, right? And the group to the north would actually make a form of beer from the grain that they got from cultivating millet, African millet. The people I live with, and I literally live with them in a house, right, were Muslims. And Muslims don't drink beer, more or less, but, they weren't, I suppose, entirely card carrying Muslims. They'd been converted 50 years before by a traveling Marabu, holy man, this kind of a thing. In any case, so I've seen millet, and the people I live with grew millet, but they use it as a grain to make different kinds of things, right? It's a plant that is sort of looks somewhat like corn when corn gets very high, but it doesn't have these ears that come out along the sides. Rather, up on the top, it has a flowery kind of thing that produces these grain pods up there, right? And it can get pretty high, right? Can grow 10, 12, 14 feet high, right? And so at different points of the year during the cycle of the plants, villages progressively, disappear behind the millet because they plant all the way around the houses, right? Okay, so where are we? Okay, so in Ireland, then, in Ireland, in Japan, the Japanese then are forced to by changes to after they um, kill all of the large animals there, they're sort of forced to take on food production, right? Kind of a thing. When we move on the mainland, we get two river basins developing around the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, as I suggested, right? They have most of the sort of core elements to create a riverine civilization based on the extreme fertility of the soil, sunlight, water for irrigation, a challenge in the start, right? Okay, so the two cultigens they have are rice in the south and millet in the north. Um, these two constituted the staples that were adapted to local environments and ended up helping to support large sedentary populations. So you had the growth of villages and towns along rivers where that was available. So archaeologists have found, for example, um, rice cultivation on the Yangtze River, in the Yangtze River Valley, dating from 6500 BCE. So, sort of, that's the earliest indication of the beginning of um, rice farming in the southern regions. Similarly, archaeologists have discovered in the Yellow River Valley, then around dated to 1,000 years later, around 5500 BC, the first emergence of millet as a domesticated crop, right? Um, Now, these have core areas that they come from, and the book gives you a map showing that. It's actually a pretty good map, right? But then it indicates that once it starts, it begins to spread out into neighboring areas out of these core areas. In addition to which, archaeologists have found evidence for uh, plow uh, systems of plowing. Um, and we spoke about the indications for the domestication of horses and the stages that they went through. Well, here, oxen and water buffalo apparently will get domesticated, and then will be sort of and they have to develop. I don't know if you've ever seen them, right? They have these kind of like hmm, it's hard to describe, right? Like a piece of wood that goes over the front, the back of the animal and connects to the other animals, and the two of them then pull the plow together behind them, right? Kind of a thing, right? And what's going to happen is that step in conjunction already with the presence of sort of relatively dense populations along the rivers, you bring in that technology, and then you can increase because you can dig down deeper in um, and expand the cultivation and the size of the fields, particularly in the areas in the north for millet where the ground is very dry and hard, but also in the south as well, where you want to dig deeper for the rice and the rice plants. Um, so all of this leads to a situation where by 5000 BCE, which, you know, is not too far removed from the Fertile Crescent dating stuff going on there. By 5000 BCE, both millet in the north and rice in the south are under widespread cultivation, leading to population centers developing. But China doesn't follow the example of either Egypt or Mesopotamia. It moves much more slowly. The book suggests that um, great riverines, uh, great riverine cities and civilizations did not arise until 1600 with the Shang Dynasty that we'll be looking at in the next class. Um, Let me see if I can find what I wanted to say. So, um, so again, let me repeat: both the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers had all the characteristics for riverine civilizations: annual floods, extensive floodplains, using silt, suitable to produce agricultural surpluses that could support dense populations. Still, in China, the evolution of hydraulic works, which are irrigation systems that require a degree of centralized control and organization, the evolution of hydraulic works, big cities, um, priestly and or bureaucratic classes, um, writing systems took longer. And so there is this gradual buildup, and there's a degree of trade and exchange between neighboring towns and cities. Still, nevertheless, so the text says this: um, in in the river basins that we're looking at, abundant food, because there is this fertile soil and water and things like that, right? Abundant food. Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Abundant food um, tied in with communities being widely dispersed, because we're talking about a very, very large landscape here. Communities being widely dispersed um, produces something different. It tends to produce localized agrarian cultures, which will then be analyzed in terms of the ceramic culture that sort of coordinates with them, right? Only later, only after 1600, do complex cities arrive and begin to emerge and then begin to develop political systems of domination around them, right? Um, Effectively, the knowledge of this period comes entirely from archaeology, right? And hence the importance of ceramics. Now, in classical Chinese writing, which talks about the flow of the dynasties and this kind of a thing, because China will develop a very very conservative um, form of civilization that sort of um, attempts to follow the precedent set by the past, right? And so they see the earliest, in this case, the Shia dynasty, dating somewhere around 2200, as sort of setting the precedent and establishing the framework for future groups to come in and claim. And increasingly, then, this will become more and more the reality, although as contemporary scholars go back and study it, they realize that history gets rewritten along the way in a number of different ways, right? So the knowledge of this period comes from archaeology, hence the importance of ceramics. Um, and so in terms of the Shia dynasty, which supposedly unified all of China and all this kind of stuff, right? It is for contemporary scholars to be somewhat like a semi-mythical dynasty. Um, there is little archaeological support for it. Um, the text then suggests that not that we follow the lead of the archaeologist, who sort of place the origins not of you know urban civilization and the urban revolution, but rather the sort of the um, how can we pay it, the material foundations for um, uh, complex society and complex civilization, which will come after it in the period between 4000 and 2000, a period which, as we saw, Egypt, Mesopotamia have already developed kings and kingships and trade and markets and um, ceremonies and you know uh, religions and gods and all this kind of stuff, right? But what we have in China is a growth of agrarian populations in these clusters, but that these clusters are separated from one another, and they then develop a number of sort of cultures, what archaeologists would call cultures, and cultures are based on the presence of ceramics of a certain style and of a certain type that they use then to date all of the material around that, right? And so literally we get three separate coming out of China. Let me see if I can pronounce them. The Yangshao culture, which produces painted pottery beginning as early as 5000 all the way through to right on the cusp of civilization 1700, but in certain areas, right? And at different times and spreading in different ways, right? Followed up uh, by the Longshao black pottery, which seems to be dated around 2500, right? And represents sort of um, an increase in the level of civilization represented by the Langshao. Um, with their black pottery, they seem to have wheels. They have a number of different aspects of sort of an agrarian civilization beginning to develop the sort of the necessary tools to sort of grow and expand. Finally, you have the Langzhou culture, which is represented by jade objects. And not only jade objects, um, there's a picture in the book, right? So jade is a precious stone that becomes, at this point in time in China, an object of I wouldn't say veneration, but certainly a highly appreciated object. And the Longsha will take it and carve it into a variety of different things and carve things on it as well, right? Um, Now, all of these cultures in this part of the world are going to confront the same issue that we've seen for Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus River Valley, which is this drought, this sort of global drought that confronts everyone more or less somewhere between 2200, 2100, and up as late as 2000, right? It's going to put brakes on the expansion of the civilization that these groups are developing, right? So it limits their progress, what they can do. Um, it sort of destroys trade networks, um, but China will recover in the years after that and begin the process of growth and development. So after 2000, we get the growth and development that's going to lead to the emergence of this new group. Um, okay, so textbook ends with this. It says this this process of recovery from the drought um, will lead to a social and political system that emphasized an idealized past, beginning with the Shia dynasty, that archaeologists have failed to find any clear indications of, and a tradition represented by sage kings whose wisdom helped to establish things like irrigation systems, respect for governance, and these kinds of things. And that's the stuff we'll get into the next class, when the next lecture, when I sort of put it together and give it to you. Then, okay, thank you very much.